Добро вечер на сите, вие сте со најновата епизода на Коридор број 8, датумот е 8 септември, ден на независноста на Република Северна Македонија. Денеска наш гостин е професор од Универзитетот во Чикаго, Антони Калделис, светски познат византолог. Со него ќе зборуваме за Бугарија и Византија во времења на мир и војна.
We will do that in English. You can actually remove the banner. So dear viewers of Corridor 8 podcast, it is indeed our honor and a privilege to introduce to you Professor Anthony Kaldellis of the famous University of Chicago in this episode. So this is one of those series of academic talks on this podcast, Corridor 8. So Professor Kaldellis is a part of the Department of Classics at the University of Chicago. He is the author of numerous highly acclaimed works in his area, some of which are worth mentioning. Well, all of them are worth mentioning, but we won't be able to do that. So some of which are particularly important: Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, The Rise and Fall of the Byzantium, Roman Land, Ethnicity and Empire in Byzantium, and the New Roman Empire. So without further ado, we're really pleased to introduce to you Professor Anthony Kaldellis.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Professor Kaldellis, we're really privileged and honored that you accepted our invitation. And we would like to start this podcast with something like introduction to your personality. And actually, we would like to ask you, what sparkled your interest towards history? We know that you studied physics, and then we made this professional shift towards history. What was the most provocative thing that made you think about history, especially the Byzantium history?
Well, I should say that I'm the product of the Greek educational system, which was back then, at least, I don't know about now, oriented primarily to produce engineers and doctors, and later, to a lesser degree, lawyers and economists, and to an even lesser degree, humanists. So I was good at math and physics and biology and things like that. And I came to the US for college to study precisely those topics. I did have other interests in philosophy, primarily, philosophy and history, or the history of philosophy. Those were not at all very well covered in the Greek educational system. And I realized that once I reached the University of Michigan in the 90s, just how many opportunities there were to study those topics in more interesting ways. And I had access to this wonderful library, and I began to read, and just gradually my interests took me from the natural sciences to the history of philosophy. So before I became a historian, I was primarily interested in the history of philosophy. My first degree was in philosophy. And the reason why I landed in the study of Byzantium, as it was called then, was because it combined very many of the themes that interested me in ancient and medieval and modern history, specifically aspects of the classical tradition and ancient Greek. Also, the ideas of Roman law and governmentality, and also the history of Christianity in both practice and the doctrines and the theology. And all of those things come together in an unprecedented and unique way in the Eastern Roman Empire. And so I thought it would just be a very interesting kind of laboratory in which to study their interactions while keeping my options open. I mean, I still, I'm in many ways a trained classicist, so in ancient history, and I've always worked in a classics department, so I'm always in touch with developments that are happening in the study of classical antiquity. And the attractions of Byzantium, in a certain sense, was that it was very, well, at the time, underdeveloped as a research field. There were many areas where there was like maybe one article or nothing, and there were so many texts that were unread. And to a certain degree, that's still true. There's a lot more opportunity there than in classics. And so I always found the view from the later period that is from Byzantium, looking back at the classical tradition, to be just a very stimulating kind of interaction of different disciplines and different perspectives. Eventually, I became much more of a conventional historian. I mean, my early work focuses more on like reading authors and sort of close readings, things that classicists tend to do. So I worked on Procopius and Telos and other authors like this. And over time, I have become much more of a boring conventional historian. And the culmination of that kind of work is my recent history of Byzantium, the 1,000-page book, which focuses on economic, social, political history.
And in your opinion, of all the impressive phenomena in the history and culture of the Eastern Roman Empire, which one is the most fascinating?
Right now, I would have to say its longevity, what we might call its resilience and endurance over more than a millennium of some of the most difficult periods of history that any society can ever be asked to weather. And that is something that I'm working on right now, just kind of thinking about how we might try to explain this phenomenon, because there are very few societies in human history that have maintained not only a kind of core sense of their identity and their language and culture in a relatively coherent and intact way over such a long period of time, but have done so as a autonomous state. I find that the emphasis in my field has been so overwhelmingly on periods of decline and fall, like loss of territories and so forth, that we've missed what I think is the most important part of the story, that it lasted for so long. Why? This is not common in that period of history. That is, for me, right now, the most fascinating aspect of the story.
And really, why it existed so long? It's really interesting question. Did you find your answer?
No, I'm working toward an answer. Part of the difficulty of this question is in trying to explain things that didn't happen. Because when you compare it to peer polities and states like the Carolingian Empire, the Caliphate, or whatever, you realize that they tend to fall apart from the inside. And all kinds of things happen to them. Provinces break away, warlords establish separate little realms, or they just divide it up. The leadership divides it up among themselves. It breaks into pieces. Parts of it become ungovernable, or they can't collect taxes. These things don't happen in the Eastern Roman Empire. And I think this is one of the keys to its longevity. But that then displaces the question into why didn't those things happen? And to a certain degree, I mean, they're always a possibility. They happen in some low-key ways. So how are we to understand the fact that it actually had very few forces of internal dissolution that impacted its peers and neighbors to such a much more devastating way? Yeah.
Cool. And our first official question to this evening is that one. So, what significance does the establishment of Danube, Bulgaria, at the end of the 7th century had for Byzantium? Which do you think prevails, symbiosis or the desire for mutual absorption?
Yes. So I would like first to set a little bit of the stage. So when the Bulgars crossed the Danube and they establish their presence south of the Danube in the late 7th century, this is at a moment of extreme crisis and disruption in East Roman history. So specifically in the 630s, Constantinople had lost control of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt to the Arab conquests, and was coping with pretty extreme attacks into Asia Minor by the Arabs, maybe 2, sometimes 3 a year. There were occasional attempts made to conquer Constantinople both by sea and by overland Arab armies. So that's one major crisis. The second one is that in order to prioritize the struggle against the emerging caliphate, the authorities in Constantinople had pretty much pulled most of their forces out of the Balkans. So they retained control over some areas in southern and coastal Greece, but the interior of most of the Balkans that had been under imperial control were now, well, it's difficult to say because our sources are terrible, but under the control of various Avar, Slav, groups. And so we have very little information about what was going on inside, away from the coasts. And right at that moment, a new power, so the Bulgars established themselves south of the Danube. So I would like at this point to put that arrival into context of a pattern. It actually does fit a certain pattern, and this is something that had happened to the Western Roman Empire. So the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire sometimes faced similar situations, and this was one of them. In other words, the arrival of foreign people in the form of an army that is maybe something like 15,000 warriors, could be 15, could be 20,000, sometimes accompanied by their women and children. So we were looking at an overall population pattern of maybe 80 to 100,000 people. This is something that had happened before. It had happened with the Vandals and Alans in the 5th century that took over North Africa. It had happened with Goths. So Theodoric's Goths, who eventually took over Italy, had done the same thing. It had happened with Franks and Burgundians and other groups as well. So it's part of a pattern. These groups established themselves on Roman provinces or former Roman provinces, where the majority of the population is Roman. Whatever language they might be speaking, it could be Latin, it could be Greek, it could be some of the sort of vernacular, other languages in Western Europe. And eventually, those groups tend to assimilate linguistically to the language of the majority population. So this is why the Franks who settled in Gaul eventually spoke French, not Frankish, right? Why the Lombards also spoke Italian, another descendant of Latin, not Lombardic, and so forth. And this is what happened to the Bulgars. Eventually, they emerge as a sort of Slavic-speaking leadership group because they assimilated to the language of one of the major populations in their dominion, which tells us that by this point, between the late 600 and 800 or so, a large part of the population of that region was Slavic speaking. This is not something that we would have known from the sources before 600. It doesn't appear that that process had developed very much. So that's one interesting part of the pattern. The other pattern that we see is that groups that armies, rather, sort of, quote, barbarian armies that settle in Roman provinces in this way, the ones that settle closest to Constantinople are the least successful in the long term. So, for example, we have the barbarian kingdoms that are established in the West, but a number of them don't make it. The Vandals don't make it. The Ostrogoths don't make it. And this is because Justinian's armies defeated them and reconquered those territories. And because those groups were a kind of military leadership, ruling over the large majority of the population in those provinces, those, as an army, they're dispersed. They're either defeated or they're dispersed or, relocated somewhere else. And those groups disappear. Like, there are no Vandals in North Africa. There are no Ostrogoths in Italy, right? Farther groups tend to survive longer just because they're further away from Constantinople and the reach of its armies. So even though Justinian sent armies to Spain, they only managed to conquer a bit of it. The Visigothic kingdom survived, right? The Franks, the Burgundians, those are beyond reach on the other side of the Alps, right? So the interesting thing about the Bulgars is that they are, in fact, very close to Constantinople. And in fact, in the long term, they do succumb to Constantinople. Constantinople does manage to reconquer those territories, but it happens so much later, right? Like 4 centuries later, that we're no longer talking about a military leadership group, like an army that's ruling over a local population that can be presented as liberated by the East Roman armies from this barbarian oppressor, right? By the time the conquest of Bulgaria happens, like the early 11th century, this is not just an army, it's a population. Like by this point, the leadership and the local population have merged to create a new people. And so it can't just be dispersed, right? You can't just go back to what you had before. And then you just have a conquered people who speak a different language and possibly have affiliation to a different political tradition and different identities and so forth. Because of that time lag, right? This is what the Ostrogoths never got to do. This is what the Vandals never got to do. And it also, it's because those two groups that I just mentioned, they didn't convert to the Constantinopolitan version of Christianity. They remained sort of Arians. And so this created another element of difference between them and the local population. But that's not the case in Bulgaria. So for those differences, those reasons, the history and the trajectory of Bulgaria and in relation to Constantinople is very different. But I just wanted to bring in those patterns from the Western Mediterranean because I think they're relevant, both for their similarities and for the differences. Now, I'll just say one more thing to create a bit of the big picture context here, because you mentioned hostility versus sort of symbiosis. And I just want to note that between 700 and 971, when a sort of real kind of phase of total war begins between Constantinople and Bulgaria. So between 700 and 971, this is 270 years. There are only 55 years of active warfare between the two, which means that there are about 220 years of peaceful coexistence, and in fact, sometimes quite fruitful collaboration between the two. We all understand how periods of war and narratives of war sort of draw our attention and are more exciting and gripping and so forth, but we have to be careful not to make those the norm. They were not the norm by a factor of, even less than 1 to 4 in this relationship. For the most part, it was peaceful. Not, how should I put it? Not necessarily brotherly, and sometimes, the expression that good fences make good neighbors was applied. That sort of Bulgarian rulers were sometimes often very keen to demarcate territories in various ways, whether by treaty or these enormous earthworks or whatever. But sometimes maintaining clear boundaries is essential for a stable framework of a stable relationship between neighbors. So that's the big picture framework that I just wanted to put out there.
And maybe I just want to follow up on that. So that kind of really set the tone for the next question, which is the pattern of conflict and cooperation that existed between Bulgarian and the Eastern Roman Empire. And so while, as you mentioned, 225 years of peace was quite substantial. So, yes, some of those battles were successful for Bulgaria. Some of the battles that Byzantium had were very successful, and in the end of the day, Byzantium ultimately destroyed the first Bulgarian empire and wiped it completely out, but didn't wipe out the population of it and the loyalty that the population had developed. So what we wanted to hear is a little bit about your take, because we don't talk too much about this alteration between rivalry and cooperation. Good fences make good neighbors, or maybe not. So can you talk a little bit about that, and particularly what instances of cooperation existed between the Bulgarian, the Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire?
Yes, of course. So I think it's more important for me to first explain why why the periods of peace and collaboration would have been so much longer and significant. Because, having a power such as Bulgaria, which kept growing in power over those centuries, might be considered a major threat. From the standpoint of Constantinople, it's fairly close. Why was it not for so long? Well, so that region in which the Bulgars initially settled and from which they expanded to create their state, mostly, expanding westward, possibly northward. So not into areas necessarily that were critical for the East Rome. That area had long been a very problematic area. If you recall, this is where the Goths crossed over, and we have the Battle of Adrianople with a great deal of confusion and chaos in the Balkans, and this is in the late 4th century. More Goths again in the 5th century, also the Huns, and in the 6th century it just becomes a corridor through which Slavs raid, and Huns, and more Huns, and like even some Proto-Bulgars and other people like Gepids and so forth. It's a very problematic area for the way Constantinople, looks at the world, the sort of lower Danube. So having a group that settled there that might not be under your control, but if you maintain peaceful relationship with it, it can act as a buffer and prevent that kind of pattern from continuing. And that is kind of exactly what it did. So in a certain sense, you give up the lower Danube, but you also get a certain amount of security and peace of mind that if there's any kind of problem that will come from the steppe, or it will be dealt with by someone else first. And I think that's a major geostrategic consideration. Why go to war with these people when they're actually providing you with a solid benefit? And you will notice that the period of intensified warfare at the end of the 10th century, so from 970 on, occurs precisely at a moment when, at that Bulgaria fails to prevent the arrival of another predatory group, the Rus. And the emperors in Constantinople, Ioannis Tsimiskis, has to go to war against both of them because they're now a threat to Roman Thrace, right? And that kind of function that Bulgaria had been providing had been breaking down a little bit even during the 10th century, when we have Magyars, so Hungarian, Proto-Hungarians, crossing through Bulgarian-ruled territories and attacking Roman Greece and the Roman Balkans. And there were a lot of diplomatic protests, like, why are you letting these people through, right? So that function seems to have been breaking down. And Ioannis Tsimiskis apparently must have decided that, okay, they're not fulfilling this function anymore, and we might as well extend our reach to the Danube in what is today eastern Bulgaria in order to do it ourselves, right? Because you don't want people like Sviatoslav, Rus coming down all the time. So that's one function. But there were also other critical moments, and when the Bulgars helped the Romans against the Arabs. This is especially during the major siege of Constantinople in 717, when they did provide a critical role. The emperor was Leo III, and he had prepared all of the defenses of Constantinople pretty well, especially the fleets and the Greek fire and all of that. But a very important role was played by allied Bulgar soldiers in defeating the Arab armies. So there were other benefits to be had there as well. So I think that for those reasons, especially since northern Thrace or that Danube region had always been a kind of problematic area, that I don't think the emperors were particularly eager to rule it again directly. But they would if they had to. I mean, I can go into the details about this, but after all of the Gothic and Hunnic wars, this was not a region that, how should I put it, paid for itself. Yeah, that's a good. We have evidence that suggests it wasn't paying for itself, and that the state had to sort of subsidize military units and their installations there from resources that came from outside of Thrace. So in a kind of cost-benefit analysis, I think it worked for Constantinople in that sense.
Okay, next question. Just let me.
The first one.
Number 3.
Dear Professor, what is known about the infusion of the Bulgarian aristocracy into the Byzantine aristocracy after the final contest of Bulgaria and the beginning of the 11th century? How which Bulgarian aristocrats settled among their Byzantine colleagues?
Yeah, now that's an excellent question, and this definitely happened, but it is very difficult to trace these people, and it is difficult to trace these people. Now, who are you talking about? So let me give you a little bit of background in case people in the audience might not know. So during the long war between Basil II and Bulgaria, so roughly from 990 to 1018. This is a very long, it's one of the longest wars in Roman history. We know, well, our sources for this war are terrible. They're just terrible. So bad that we can't actually give a narrative. We can't write a narrative of it. It's impossible. It's in fact, some historians have argued that the war was basically on pause for the decades that we don't have information about. And I'm not convinced by that, but the fact that you can credibly make that argument shows you just how bad our sources are for quite a few decades there. But we know that during this war, one of Basil's strategies was to try to woo Bulgarian leadership cadres over to his side. By the usual methods of Byzantine persuasion, that is giving them cash and titles and fancy clothes and status and prestige and attention. And who doesn't want all of those things? And so it was definitely possible to sort of seduce them and win them over. At that point, those people, usually, I mean, Bulgarian elites tend to be military elites, would then be posted in the Roman armies, given command positions, preferably somewhere else, so they don't have any sort of divided loyalties or anything like that. But that is a loss, definitely, to the Bulgarian side. They might bring their own people with them. They might bring their own sort of local territories with them. So there's more to be gained there than just, high-ranking individuals. Now, the problem is, of course, that these people being Orthodox and generally having similar names to the Romans, then sort of become invisible. It's very difficult to identify them by like their seals. If they remained in office or had court titles, they would have their own seals usually, and we can identify some of them, but they would tend to write their names in the Greek way, Georgios or Nikolaos or whatever. And so they're just very difficult to spot. The one group that we do know more about is the Bulgarian imperial family, or the various sub-branches of it that Basil took back to Constantinople. And this was a pretty large group of people, because from Samuil all the way down to Ivan Vladislav, there was a number of them, and they had children and cousins and so forth. And they were brought to Constantinople, where they were part of Basil's triumph, the triumphal celebration, but I don't think that they were paraded in a humiliating fashion. So in Roman triumph, so this is a military parade into either Rome or Constantinople, the general marches and then the soldiers, but the parade is preceded by the captives or the defeated people, or in this case, an entire imperial family. And in some cases, the Romans sort of wanted to sort of humiliate them and make, it's like parade them naked or, whatever. But I don't think so in this case. I think in this case, they are more like guests of honor. And many of them we know later were given command positions in provinces, though usually in Asia Minor or far away in the Caucasus. Some of them show up later there. So you just want to keep them out, keep them away from their sort of native, provinces where they might cause trouble, as in fact some of them did in 1040. And they were intermarried with the Roman aristocracy. This is easy to do because they're also Orthodox. And so there are no problems like from the church. I mean, according to Roman law of this period, it is illegal to marry someone who is not Orthodox. And so this is very easy to do. And so the two imperial families kind of, not two imperial families, but the two aristocracies kind of merged in a way. But we can follow the careers of some of the more prominent Bulgarian individuals because they're mentioned in the sources. And I will mention one extraordinary case, which is a daughter of the last Tsar Ekaterini, who was married to, eventually married one of the members of the emerging military aristocracy that Basil himself had created. And this was the Komnenos family. And she married Isaakios Komnenos, who went on to become a major general and later emperor in 1057 to 59. And so she then, from being a Bulgarian imperial princess, went to being a Roman empress. And no problem. I don't think anyone in Constantinople thought that her origins were a problem. They're not mentioned that way. She's treated straight up as a Roman empress, the way any empress would be treated. And she has the extraordinary distinction of being a person who was both paraded as someone captured in a Roman triumph, and when her husband was emperor, being someone who was honored in a triumph because her husband was leading it. And this is quite extraordinary, but it does happen in the Roman tradition because generally Romans are pretty good at assimilating other elites this way, provided in this period that there's no major religious difference. So that's what I had to say in general about the absorption of Bulgarian elites in the early 11th century.
Good. And the next question that we had, it's related to the same phenomena about integration of aristocracies from different countries into the Roman political and social elite. And the question that we have about this. So since we know that in the Bulgarian history, there are also other examples of Bulgarian aristocrats who became part of the elite of the Eastern Roman society, like the descendants of John Ascend II. Some of them became Roman aristocrats, keeping their Ascend surname in the 13th and even in the 14th century. But was it possible for medieval Bulgarian, Armenian, Frank, etc., to become a full-fledged Roman, a true citizen of the empire, and fully integrate into its Roman society without, however, abandoning his ethnic identity?
So I'm going to treat this as two questions. The first one being, is it possible to assimilate and become a full-fledged Roman? And the second one being, without losing one's ethnic identity. And the answer to the first one is absolutely yes. This is something that Romans were always very good at. They could do it to small individuals. They could do it to small groups. They could do it to entire populations given enough time. So these Bulgarians who, for one reason or another, ended up either living in the Roman state or working for the Roman emperor, holding titles, positions, and so on, they eventually are treated as, they assimilate and are treated no differently from any other Roman. And this would have been especially true for their children and grandchildren, I mean, all the more so. When it comes to the question of without losing their ethnic identity, here we run into problems because it depends on what you define that as. So if we mean it in a sort of very robust sense, in other words, if you were to ask this person, are you a Roman or a Bulgarian? And they would say, oh, no, I'm a Bulgarian. And then I would have to say no. There are very few people about whom I would suspect that they would say such a thing. These are, in other words, they're Greek speaking. Their entire lives and careers are spent in Constantinople or Romania. They don't exhibit any signs of affiliation, loyalty, or particular interest in Bulgaria. However, there are, as we know, from our own lives, from our own societies, there are degrees of this sort of thing. It's not necessarily a yes or no kind of question. So keeping a name like that is a way of remembering a kind of origin, a past, an ancestral connection. And in these societies, especially, so this question was about the 13th century and after. In the 13th and 14th centuries, these kinds of connections are very, very useful to have, because this is a much more chaotic and fluid situation with, not just Romans and Bulgarians, but also, Serbs and Vlachs and Wallachians and Turks and the Latins all over the place. So it's a much more fluid situation. And in that context, it's always beneficial to have connections to other sides and be able to establish some sort of link with them for negotiations, for mutual hospitality, and so forth. And we find in this period that the aristocracies and the ruling families are intermarrying like crazy. They are constantly marrying each other's daughters and sisters and whatever left and right, so that any given emperor or tsar has family connections to every other state in the Balkans, and I think this is a strategy on their part. In other words, ethnic identity is one thing, but it doesn't rule out that you maintain some sort of effective ties to other groups based on ancestry or marriage affiliations or trade or service or other kinds of ways. So it comes down to what we mean by identity. In other words, what kinds of acts do we expect people to engage in to say, this is their identity? It's very difficult to do that with the historical records that we have. But by and large, I would say that the rule of thumb is, no, they assimilate and they become just like other Romans, and they don't display any interest in setting themselves apart from Romans in this way. But that also doesn't mean that they're not also keeping their options open and maintaining lines of communication and affiliation with other groups. Beyond that, we're looking at it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Do you want to follow up on that? I mean, maybe the question was asking about something specific.
There is some, yes. In your book, Roman Land, Ethnicity and Empire in Byzantium, you gave a lot of examples of how ethnicity has importance for the Roman people. They claim to be a specific genus. They were separate ethnically, and they didn't want their emperors to marry foreigners. They wanted that their leaders should marry only people from the same genus, from the same gene. How this was especially in the early centuries of the Eastern Roman Empire. What changed, in your opinion, in the society in order to become more open and inclusive towards such marriages, like with Bulgarian princes or something similar?
Yeah, that tended to happen pretty late. So in general, the East Roman aristocracy doesn't intermarry very much until you get to the 11th or late 11th century. And at that point, especially with the Komneni, you have a much more extensive policy of intermarriage with foreigners. In fact, the marriages of the Komneni family at large, not just the dynasty more narrowly speaking, became a matter of state policy, and so needed approval by the emperor. But you see a very diversified marriage policy at that point, and to a certain degree, the aristocracy did so as well. And this at that point, it encompassed and focused primarily on Western Europe, but also Georgia in the Caucasus. And I've mentioned already the Bulgarian imperial family, which was absorbed in this way. And the main a factor here is, other than geopolitics, is religion. In other words, that there's no sort of religious barrier here. So they're not intermarrying so much, for example, with Armenian, Arab, right? So when I mention that, you realize, okay, well, that's just off. But why not? Well, religion is a major factor there. It's somewhat smaller in the case of Armenians, but still there. Whereas with Georgians and Bulgarians, and for a while, the Latin West, it's not. Increasingly, as the Roman state gets smaller and it becomes a sort of Balkan state, and as the opportunities for marriage with Latins diminish because of the growing schism between the churches, like Western powers now need permission from the Pope to marry someone to the family in Constantinople. And it's very difficult. And so as it contracts to the Balkans and the Latin opportunities are not there, and also Georgia is now very far away, suddenly, Bulgarians and Serbs are your nearest kind of interlocutors and possible in-laws. It just makes much more sense because they're also the people you need for your geostrategic environment. There's also Trebizond, which is another Roman state in the Pontus. And sometimes relations are maintained with Georgia in this way. But this is why Orthodox people in the Balkans become suddenly much more important, especially in the 14th century. That's one reason for that, yeah.
And speaking about Orthodoxy, I think that Ivan has a very interesting question to ask you.
So my question, actually, the one that I picked to ask, is related to the Cyrillic alphabet, the creation of the Cyrillic alphabet, Cyril and Methodius, and then there's their students, and then the codification. And it has actually three different parts. So I've injected an additional part to what this has been listed here in the lengthy question. So first of all, we have this problem of certain historiographies in certain parts of the Balkans, particularly our neighbors from now North Macedonia, tend to kind of completely eject and extract the role of the state into the codification of the language and the creation of the culture and its incorporation into the religious and frankly into the literary life during that period. So my first part of the question is, what is the role indeed of the Bulgarian state, and can you verify that this could have happened? And I know it's a little bit counterfactual, but could any of this codification, creation of this language and culture could have happened without the role of the Bulgarian state and the Bulgarian royal family and the cultural centers that were created? So what is this, the literature, your own take, but also overall take in the literature on the topic tell us? And second aspect of the question is, once this literature was created and it codified, what impact did it have to other parts of the world, especially to neighboring Serbia, Russia, etc.? And the third part of the question is, once this has created a subculture within the Byzantine world and within the general Orthodox culture, what is its impact, the language and the culture and the codification, into the overall Orthodox culture? So impact, the role of the state, the impact on the adjacent territories, other parts of the world, and then the impact on the overall Orthodox culture or general Orthodox culture.
That's an impressive combination of topics.
We're trying to combine as many aspects as possible, and also some of the questions that our viewers are asking. So if I fail, I plead guilty on that attempt. But I think and I know it's a very broad, but I think a broad question also gives you an opportunity to go in many different directions to talk about.
Sure. So the part of it that I was not prepared for, it wasn't even in what you read, was about the role of the state. Now I'm interested in the role of the state in general, so I'm improvising an answer here with an asterisk that I could be wrong, but I could be wrong also in how I'm interpreting the question. Like, is an institution like the Bulgarian state necessary in order to not only sort of codify a script, but create the body of writings and the institutions that create them and generate them? Yeah. No, I mean, the answer is it's not necessary, though it did play a major role in this case. But the creation of a distinctive script, or relatively distinctive, in order to create a new, let's say, non-Greek, non-Latin form of Christian worship, is not new. The Slavic case is one of many, many others that are happening across the first millennium, and they don't all happen at the instigation of a state, or even with the mediation of any state institution. So if you think, for example, of the Coptic script, which was devised, late third century to write Egyptian. This was, the Roman state had no involvement in that whatsoever. This was done on private Christian initiative, and it created a script that was then used to produce a sort of flourishing Coptic literature. Similarly, the Gothic script, which was designed by Ulfila in the 4th century for writing Gothic. This was done by a Christian missionary who was leading his flock of Gothic Christians, and eventually they had to leave the territory that was ruled by the Goths at that time and settle in one of the Roman provinces, Pannonia. But that script was later on used when the Goths established their own states, and so on. I could give many more examples of this. In the case of Bulgaria, we just happen to know that, if not, I mean, I don't know if state institutions, but certainly state patrons played a major role in fostering this and accelerating it. So it definitely could have happened without any state intervention. And the initial stages, we know, are, mostly, pioneered by it's a private, let's say, Christian missionaries and individuals from Cyril Methodius onward. But then once you have a patron who also is, a tsar, then the process accelerates very quickly. and you start having like massive translations and the buildup of a sort of indigenous literature. So that makes a huge difference. It's quite possible that, within 50 years, there are more Christian writings in Slavic and Slavonic than had been produced in Coptic at the same, in the same period of time in Egypt when it was being Christianized. And that's because you have major support and sponsorship. In fact, the direct involvement by Simeon in the process. And you already have monasteries, and I mean the whole institutional apparatus for doing such a thing exists. You just have to sort of foster it. So I mean that's what I'll say about that. We can talk about it more if you want to qualifications or challenge any part of that. As for the creation of a sort of Slavic Orthodoxy, this is obviously a very much discussed topic, and it has become rather tedious in reading the bibliography. I mean, this is so over and over again. This keeps saying the same old things. Like if I never read about Cyril and Methodius again, I was gonna die a happy man. But be that as it may, there's some very interesting work about the invention of the script and about Cyril and Methodius and their lives by Mirela Ivanova. You might want to talk to her about that. She has a book just came out on this topic. I forget the exact title, but you can find it easily enough. It's by Oxford University Press. And she's doing some very interesting new things. They're definitely worth thinking about. They're different from the usual script of, celebrating Language Day and, this kind of thing. So I will say the following, just to put this process into perspective from someone who studies Greek text primarily from this period. And so, yes, this process certainly resulted in creating pathways across states, across ethnic boundaries, which was very, very important. Now, it was primarily important for people in the church and for various monastic types, where you can see that they are moving very fluidly in a world of Orthodox culture that transcended differences of language and ethnicity in the Balkans initially, and that this was very important for them. These are the kinds of people to whom sort of state boundaries don't mean very much, and yeah, I understand that. So this is a very interesting and important development for that purpose. And what happened in Bulgaria as a kind of paradigm of state Christianization could be exported to other countries, especially to the north, as other kings decide to, take on the same process. So it was a kind of gateway. Having said that, as a Byzantinist, I will note certain asymmetries in this process. So when I look at lists of translated Greek works, and I think Thompson produced a very interesting, very long list of these works that we know, they are all patristic and Christian sources of one kind or another, whether homilies or hagiographies. There is almost nothing that we would call sort of classical literature. In other words, whatever kind of, well, on the one hand, whatever kind of literary culture, religious culture, Bulgarians, other Slavic-speaking people are choosing to take from Constantinople, it is almost exclusively sort of Orthodoxy oriented, and does not include the classical, let's say, correlate of that literary culture. In other words, so Orthodox texts in Byzantium, they don't exist in a vacuum. Christianity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It emerged in the ancient Roman Empire, and it emerged in close contact and conversation with ancient, pre-Christian, classical, pagan, Platonic, whatever, philosophies, literatures, genres of writing, and so forth. And they always coexisted in a kind of tense but productive relationship throughout the Byzantine millennium. In fact, these are like the two poles of an educated Roman's mind, and they called them like the inside stuff and the outside stuff, or the Christian stuff and the Greek stuff. But even though there's this kind of asymmetry, they formed part of a whole. And so you have, you have ancient epigrams, and you have Christian epigrams, and you have ancient lives, and you have Christian lives, and histories, and orations, and so forth. That does not continue as a kind of package in the dissemination of orthodoxy to the North, which I'm pretty sure has some interesting consequences on how the Christian body of knowledge and Christian texts are received, but this is almost never studied. And it is almost never studied because scholars don't study things that didn't happen. And there's so much fixation on the Orthodox stuff as if this is the only thing that existed, that you forget that, no, there's this whole other side of Greek literary culture that sort of got forgotten. And as someone who's also a classicist, I don't forget this. And I don't forget it, for example, because in their relations with the Arab world, the Romans were very aware of the classical side of their tradition because the Arabs were claiming it as well, right? So in their relations with the Slavic world after its conversion, the axis of communication is orthodoxy. In relation with Arab culture, sometimes at the same time, one of the main axes is classical, like be it mathematics or medicine or astronomy or these kinds of disciplines. Later, in their relationship with the Latin West, so this is toward the end of the Byzantine millennium, one of the vectors of communication with the Italians and others is again classical culture, because suddenly now the Westerners are interested in this, starting in the 14th century, and they realize that, wait a minute, Constantinople has all of this stuff. And so they're very interested in engaging with Constantinople on those lines. And Constantinople sends not missionaries, they send professors of classical studies, right? So Constantinople has these different assets that it deploys very strategically depending on the partner it's engaging with. Right?
If we look at the missions of Constantine Cyril the philosopher, he visited the Khazars on the north side of the Black Sea. He visited Rome, so he had very different approach to both cultures. This is an example of what you say now about the relationships of the Eastern Roman Empire with all these different cultures, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a bit too early for the Latins to be interested in a lot of this stuff, but he is an excellent example. So you're exactly right to bring him up as someone who, at least in his reported life, is moving east and north and west, and you can see is engaging with these different people in different ways. So with the Arabs, they have arguments about like the Roman Empire, and that that kind of thing. In the West, he has conversations, for example, about language and which languages are appropriate for Christian worship. But you're right in that he's presented to us as someone who is fully educated in the full inside and outside knowledge that one could get in Constantinople or Thessaloniki or whatever. Now, I'll also note, just in terms of general patterns, that is, from Constantinople, how you engage with your neighbors is it's a differentiated matter, right? You engage with them based on different parts of your own tradition. But I want to note that this creation of a kind of orthodox axis of worship did not really affect state relations. And so one thing that we have to be absolutely clear about, because there's a lot of the bibliography that obfuscates this issue, is that at no point was there some sort of understanding in practice that Orthodox neighboring states don't go to war against each other. In fact, they do increasingly so. So it doesn't really, if anything, it actually, especially under Simeon or later on with the long war with Basil II, you see more war rather than less once these are Orthodox neighbors. I actually don't think that there's any kind of there's no causation here. It's the way history happened. But it is important to note that Orthodoxy does not affect. It affects the way they talk to each other. Oh, my Christian brother, and spiritual brother. Yeah, it's nice. That's useful for when you want to resolve a conflict. But it doesn't seem to prevent them very much. Anyway, I'll stop there.
In relation to the alphabet, to the Slavic Orthodoxy in Bulgaria, Vedernik has a follow-up question. Why, in your opinion, the Bulgarian state had to create the Cyrillic alphabet?
I'm not an expert on this. You can ask me about this.
Yeah, it's okay.
I've heard her talk about it. I don't want to repeat what I've heard, but I'm actually not an expert on this.
It's okay that you say. Yeah. It's okay. But I think that probably Vedernik isn't interested in my opinion, but I think that probably because the Bulgarians already knew much better the letters of the Greek alphabet. All scriptures, stone scriptures, everything written in stone in the previous 2 centuries was in Greek. So probably it was easier to use on a daily basis. But this is my opinion. And if it speak about the daily base, actually we hit our next question, which is related to this daily basis coexistence of Bulgarians, Romans. What is known about the dynamics of relations between Bulgarians and Romans, not the states, but the people? What was the balance between the respect on the one hand that the Romans felt for the Bulgarians as their neighbors, fellow Orthodox Christians, and people with whom they have frequent interactions and cohabitation, and on the other hand, the certain contempt that Roman authors traditionally show to others peoples, and specifically to the Bulgarians? They call them Scythians, barbarians. They treat the Bulgarian language with contempt, and the fact that the Bulgarians do not know proper Greek.
Well, the last bit there, that the Bulgarians do not know proper Greek. So this is addressed specifically in one text to Simeon. Simeon had spent quite a bit of time in Constantinople as a youth, and he did know Greek. Now, he may have spoken it with an accent, but it doesn't really even matter. The text in question, which is sort of hostile to him, Greek text, wants to make him look like he's not a proper Roman, because that was actually kind of important. And so it says this about him. There's no expectation on the part of most or any Romans that Bulgarians should speak Greek. It's just not their language. But when they did try to do it like he did, then you could make fun of him if he had an accent or didn't speak it perfectly. The politics of language is just an interesting topic in its own right. This is actually used against even other Romans, and in fact, in all of our countries, we can probably think of cases where someone who is a national or a native of a country in order to be attacked. You just said, oh, he doesn't even speak Greek. He doesn't speak Bulgarian very well. He's like, he's uneducated. Yeah, there's a lot of that going on too. And they use it against their own political enemies at home too. So, it's not anyway. This is an interesting question, but it's very difficult to answer because we actually don't have, how should I put this? Roman views of Bulgarians expressed by people who are not in some way connected with the court, even distantly. In other words, I couldn't tell you what the average non-elite or non-literate Roman thought of the Bulgarians. I know that they were terrified of them when the Bulgarians were invading. As I am sure that the average Bulgarian was terrified when the Romans were invading. And, this is sort of there's a seasonal rating to this kind of experience, and it's very unpleasant, and it can disrupt your life in a major way. But in periods of peace, which, as we've seen, are many, it's just impossible to know. I'm pretty sure that Roman chauvinism extended pretty deeply. In other words, that it's not just something at the court. I'm pretty sure that most sort of Greek-speaking Orthodox Romans just believe themselves to be superior culture. This is, most cultures seem to find it very easy to persuade themselves of this. So I don't see why they shouldn't have. And in fact, all of their texts, insofar as we can access their opinions, do that. So they instinctively regard Romans and Roman civilization as being superior, the Greek language as being superior, their political system as being superior, their emperor as being superior, and almost certainly their version of Christianity being, let's say, more authentic. The Gospels are originally in their language. This is a language that they speak. And the doctrines of the church councils and the church fathers are overwhelmingly in Greek. And so I wouldn't find it difficult to believe that if anyone who's even aware of these kinds of issues as a Roman is sort of chauvinistic about it. The question is correct that sources close to the court, even after the Christianization of Bulgaria, kind of treat Bulgarians generally as barbarians. Now, in many cases, you have to be very careful with the context here. In other words, this isn't some general abstract position that they have just by default, right? So, for example, Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, he has a negative view of Bulgarians and sort of Slavs generally. It's almost kind of a racist at times. But the reason why he is that is because there was a long period, especially when he was a younger man, when another emperor, Romanos I, took the throne and kept Constantine VII around, but kind of gradually marginalized him and pushed him aside. And one thing that Romanos did was to forge a kind of dynastic marriage alliance with the Bulgarian imperial family. And Constantine VII, understandably, saw this connection with Bulgaria as part of the attempt to push him aside. And so he was very bitter about it. And he was very bitter about the idea that a Roman woman would marry, would be given to a Bulgarian prince and so forth. But she was. In other words, Constantine VII doesn't speak for his culture necessarily. We should, in fact, probably pay more attention to the fact that Maria was given to Peter, and there's no protest at the time. Nobody thought it was unseemly or undignified or anything like that, except the person who was being harmed by it. So this is why we have to be careful and evaluate these sources in their context. They don't necessarily speak to a kind of timeless contempt or anything like that.
One last question that we have for you, but if you're not very tired, you could consider after this question also to look at some of the questions from our viewers. There are some topics that maybe you are not expert, but maybe you are. Just to, for example, Professor Futinitu Ludi from Thessaloniki is watching us. She has a very nice question. But let's look at the questions that we already prepared for you, because I'm afraid we can take too much time for you.
No, don't worry on my end.
Okay, so this last question, the seventh one, it's related to the last years of the existence of the first Bulgarian Tsardom. The conquest of Bulgaria by Byzantium led to perhaps the greatest period of the latter's existence, the period of its complete domination over the Balkans and the Asia Minor, in which it was again a world great power and almost as significant as in the times of Justinian, Zeno, and the route to Persia by Heraclius. Roman authors show a certain respect for the leaders of the Bulgarian resistance, and especially for the terrible Samuel, who initially inflicted an almost devastating defeat of the Basil II. How did the empire recover from it, and what was the Basil's role in this victorious war for his country? We know that Samuel succeeded in mobilizing all the Bulgarian forces, which before him Tsar Peter and his sons Boris and Roman failed. He even conquered new Roman lands, conquered the Adriatic coast all the way to Croatia. In a short time, raised the Bulgarian Empire back on its feet after the Russian Byzantine apocalypse, which it experienced in the period 1968-1971. And yet, Byzantium prevailed. In your opinion, who are the most important factors for these successors? I must say that the question was sent to us from our friend, Associated Professor Vladislav Ivanov from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, who also sent to us a very, very short video with the main point of the question. So I will show it here.
Hi, I'm feeling very honored to address one of the best contemporary Byzantinists in the whole world, in my opinion. My question to you is, which, in your opinion, were the most important factors that led Byzantium to victory over the Bulgarian Empire led by Tsar Samuel in the 40-year-long struggle at the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century?
So this was the long question and the short question from Professor Vladislav Ivanov. We are very grateful for his help in this question. And what is the answer?
Right. So Vladislav, thank you for the question. This is a very interesting question. And in a certain sense, it's tied to my own interest in the longevity and survival of the state. East Rome and Constantinople, and why it succeeded when it succeeded rather than why it failed when it failed, because too much attention has been paid to that. As I mentioned, this particular war is very poorly documented. It's one of the least well-documented wars of this consequence that we have. So it's very difficult to speak about it. In fact, I can only reverse engineer a kind of answer from what we know happened. And let me explain a little bit something of the framework for Roman successes and Roman defeats. So in general, the Roman Empire, in any phase of its history, struggles to prevail when it's fighting against two major opponents at a time, so simultaneously. It does much, much better, for obvious reasons, when it can focus all of its efforts on one. Now, in the case of the Constantinopolitan phase of the Roman Empire's existence, this was a challenge because it would very often face a simultaneous threat from the east and the north. So it could be Persians and Avars, or it could be Arabs and Bulgars, or whatever. Later on in the 11th century, it could be Pechenegs and Seljuks, and Normans in Italy. And so generally, when there's two or more active theaters of war, the wars are less successful, or they have to make compromises or a treaty with concessions, or if they prevail, it takes a very long time. So the interesting thing about the war with Samuil is that this was a period when, for the most part, the Romans were not distracted by a war elsewhere, right? So yeah, there were some times when Basil would have to race across Asia Minor and deal with some little crisis in Syria or something like that. That happened a couple times. But it wasn't as if there was a sort of sustained war effort in the East that required massive mobilization. Which means that Basil could bring to bear on his Bulgarian problem all or most of the resources of the East Roman state at a time when it was generally safe and prosperous, and there was economic and demographic growth. And for most of its territory, especially Asia Minor, there had been a fairly long peace and period of prosperity, so lots of resources. And yet, the resolution of the war with Bulgaria takes 30 years, which is impressive. If we assume that there was fighting going on during those 30 years, this means that Bulgaria under Samuil was one of the most difficult challenges, sort of strategic or in terms of manpower, operationally, you name it, that East Rome had ever faced. Because with that concentration of power and resources that East Rome had at this time, which were significant. In fact, we can form a sort of sense of what size armies they were capable of putting into the field, what their capabilities were, added to which, siege warfare and Greek fire and things like this. I am left very, very impressed with the ability of the Bulgarian state to resist and to fight for so long and to make victory so incredibly difficult. And this is what's frustrating, is that we know very little about the internal organization and resources of the Bulgarian state at this time. Our sources are just really terrible. It is based primarily in Western Bulgaria, reaching to the Adriatic. We don't know exactly what was happening in Eastern Bulgaria during this time. It's possible that the Romans retained control of it for most of the time after 971, or it's possible that it changed hands a few times. We just don't know. But what makes this question difficult to answer is our ignorance about the infrastructural capabilities, the wealth and resources that the Bulgarian state had at this time. Now, I could talk generally about the kinds of advantages that Romans have when it comes to organization, and generally they are decisive. In other words, if the emperors want to put all of their resources into a war, they will normally prevail. That's just a pattern. So this is why I kind of flip the question on its head and ask, why was Bulgaria able to survive for so long? I think that is how we should ask the question, and not so much what enabled Basil to win. I'm not sure that it has much to do with personal factors. I mean, Basil himself, he's also hard to read. I would correct one one thing in the question, which was that the defeat that kind of kickstarts the war in sort of 986 in the past. This was not devastating. It was devastating for Basil's prestige, and it kicked off a Roman civil war, a challenge against him, because suddenly he looked very weak. But it's not as if the Romans suffered a great deal of manpower loss. Most of them just ran away. It was a defeat. It was humiliating, but it wasn't like a substantive erosion of Roman infrastructural capabilities, which remained robust. So I'm not entirely sure why the war took so long, in fact. So I'm kind of reversing the question. And I know I'm not providing a very satisfying answer, but for me to do so, I would kind of have to make stuff up. And I don't want to do that at this point. So this is just going to have to be one of those question marks until someone maybe comes along and finds a way to approach the question that the rest of us haven't thought of.
Can I take it from here? We have a couple of questions and from our viewers, so I've been going through some of them and sifting through that might be really interesting. So we'd like particularly our regular viewers to give them a chance, and I think they ask good questions. So are completely related. You can just answer very briefly or in one sentence if you it's taking you outside of your area of expertise. But one of the questions is that from our viewer Andromeda, who says, do you believe that the story of Samuel's blinded soldiers is true?
Probably not in its reported form. There are a number of reasons to be skeptical of that story. Now, Basil was capable of extraordinary acts of cruelty, especially in his punishments. He fed one of his secretaries to a lion once. He cut the hands off of like 500 Bedouin who harassed him in the Syrian desert. I mean, he could be brutal, but I just don't think that. As reported, 14,000, I don't think that that's remotely possible, in part because the war continued on for another 4 years. And I don't see how you can lose 14,000 soldiers and keep fighting, as robustly as the Bulgarians did for a while. And there are other problems with the story. But that something happened, that gave rise to it, it's entirely possible. But I'm leaning more toward the skeptical side.
Okay, so let me just go with the other question that Georgi just alluded to, Professor Foutini Touloudi from University of Thessaloniki. Back to the 7th century DC, do we have any kinds of sources regarding the living situation between the settled Slavs in the area and the Bulgars?
Not really, in part because it's very difficult to identify settled Slavs. This is one of the most controversial areas in sort of Balkan archaeology. How do you identify Slavs? That is, before we have texts and literature and so forth. And it's also very difficult to identify, Bulgars. There's some indication of, we're basically talking about graves and what people put in their graves, and it's just very difficult to link those items with these names, Slavs and Bulgars. So I'm going to pass on any further answer to this because there is a whole technical subfield of archaeology that's trying to work on this.
And then we have another question by our regular viewer, great friend Argir Stumbov, who says that, is there any Byzantine archives in which that have concretely mentioned all the persons from the Bulgarian aristocracy who had attended and were students of the Imperial University of Magnaur in Constantinople?
Oh boy. So we don't have Byzantine archives generally. So that's kind of easy to answer in that sense. Maybe by archives, they just mean the documentary textual record. So if we interpret it more broadly, there's also not got to be careful here. There's no Imperial University. Oh, this is a bit of a problem. We normally shouldn't refer to something like a university in Constantinople. There, at various times, There were networks of schools, mostly private, that were recognized by emperors in some capacity and kind of upgraded and supported. Or the emperors would sometimes pay the salaries or some sort of stipend for instructors in certain periods in certain disciplines. We shouldn't call that an imperial university or localize it, because it gives a very misleading impression. No, but I'm not answering the question here. I cannot think of anybody right now if it's not actually Simeon.
Simeon, yeah. He's the famous one. We don't know about the others.
I don't.
Probably there were some people, but especially in the early centuries, especially the decades after the Christianization of the Bulgarians, probably there were people.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to bet money, I would bet that there were. But this is a very routine kind of thing. It wouldn't be mentioned in sources. Mention things usually because they're unusual. In the Middle Ages, you don't write texts to talk about well-known or just commonplace things. Psellos, 11th century teacher, philosopher, courtier, he has a text where he talks about, all of these people are coming to study with me from all over the world. And I think he mentions Celts and like Western Europe and Arabs. I don't recall right now if he mentions anyone from Bulgaria. I don't think so. Because at that point, Bulgaria would be part of the empire. And so this would not be exotic enough for him to mention. Sorry.
And then we have one more question. That is the viewer Templar Easy. And so he's asking you about, I would actually paraphrase a little bit. Could you revisit, I promise, discuss the identity of the second Bulgarian, the founders of the second Bulgarian kingdom, which are the Assem brothers. So the question is, are they often seen as Vlachs, and could basically the Slavic Kuman or Vlach identity be interpreted as something on an equal footing identity-wise? And it has to do also with the whole bigger concept of, are we actually sharing that history with the present-day Romanian state in this spirit of shared history of the Middle Ages or not? So I think this is where the direction is going, to the extent that did Vlachs actually establish? Were they Bulgarians? Were they the meaning of what is the meaning of Vlach and Bulgaria during this period? I think that's the question of the viewer. Any take on you? You don't have to feel an expert, but any response, I think they would appreciate it, particularly from a big name scholar like yourself. So thank you.
I'm not a big name scholar. I'm just some guy. Let's be clear. This is a hugely political question. Let's just be clear about it. This is not a antiquarian curiosity kind of question or trivial one or whatever. This is the kind of question that people get into fights over. And I have seen people get into fights over this. It is the kind of question that leads to endless internet chat responses and lots of caps and exclamation points. And I imagine that the majority of our audience understands this and understands why. So...
And we don't want to get you in trouble with those people in huge cap responses.
No. I mean...
That's not the intention of this conversation.
I understand that, of course. However, this is something that I have, studied. It has come up, and I have looked into it, and I have read scholarship on all sides of this question. And as someone who has no stake in this at all, it is abundantly clear that contemporary authors are calling the members of this dynasty Vlachs. Like this in like so many languages. This cannot be just pushed aside. Now, Vlach is also not something that you would claim if you weren't in some way affiliated with Vlach groups. Like I just don't see an advantage for any of these people at that time to claim this identity or name if it didn't mean something to them. On the other hand, it does not mean that Vlach and Bulgarian are incompatible, because let me give you a different example. And I hope that this also is not sort of political. I don't think it is. But in the 5th century, we have an emperor in Constantinople who's Leo I. He's a Roman army officer. He rises through the ranks, and at some point, just general picks him and says, "You're going to be emperor." Leo I, probably Latin speaker, but he's referred to in many sources as a Bessian. A Bessian is, in this period, what we would call a Thracian. And Thracians are a group that have their own language at this time. They still do, though this is pretty much the end of it. In the 6th century, it stops being mentioned. There is no administrative region of the empire that's Bessia or anything. In other words, the only reason he would be called that is if he actually did come from this group in the same part. We're talking about the same part of the world here, only 700 years earlier. And we have an emperor here who is some sort of ethnic Bessian, but otherwise entirely Roman, and understood to be that by all of his subjects, who would never accept an emperor who was like anything other than a Roman, except for the Isaurian who followed him. And he was also a bit iffy. Again, Roman citizen from Asia Minor, but he belonged to this group called Isaurians, who were kind of like, they had this kind of, right? So in this period, it's clearly not incompatible to be a Bessian and an Isaurian, who were recognizable groups, and also a Roman. And so my question then would be, like, why is this such a problem with the Vlachs and the Bulgarians? Like, the Vlach people, insofar as they can be called a people rather than a bunch of different groups at this time, had long been a part of like the Bulgarian Empire. And we don't know exactly what their presence was in the leadership cadres. Like, for all we know, lots of the Bulgarian elites under Peter are Vlach. Like, why not? But we can't see that because we don't have the kind of granular information about ethnicity and power within the Bulgarian state, right? And suddenly we have these people who are called Vlachs, and they come along and they're reviving the Bulgarian state. And now everyone is all like alarmed and like, what's going on? Are they Vlachs or are they Bulgarians? Well, why is it a distinction? I'm like, I don't understand why this is such a big problem. Well, I understand why it's a problem, but I don't think that it necessarily has to be one. But you just have to configure your relationships between sort of smaller scale ethnic identities like Vlach and maybe overarching ones like Bulgarian, which is an imperial identity. Imperial identities are much more broad.
Thank you so much. I really loved your response, particularly the passion you put into it, because we've been somehow trying to send a very similar message across board, that it shouldn't be a problem and it should be shared. And there's a lot of stuff from the past that can and should be shared. And in fact, if we want to live well together, looking into the future, we should also learn how to share and take joint pride at the past. So I loved your answer, but this was not something that we had orchestrated in advance. So that this completely came out of it, and it's good to have it from other intellectuals heard, particularly from renowned big name scholars. So thank you for that.
I'm not a renowned big name.
You are.
Okay.
Thank you. And so
very,
what I
very
want to ask, Georgi, you want to take the floor from here?
Very independent sources told us that you are a very, very famous scholar. So we really appreciate the authenticity of the sources.
Okay.
So we have two last questions that are in the field of the what if alternative history.
Right.
So it's a semi-joke.
Okay.
This one. As far as we know, in 1351, Roman envoys arrived in the Bulgarian capital Turnovo and offered Tsar Ivan Alexander cooperation in the fight against the Turks. The Bulgarians refused and chased the messengers away with insults. What could have been the fate of Bulgaria, Byzantium, and the Balkans as a whole if 7 centuries ago Bulgarians and Romans had united?
Right. Well, independently of an episode that occurred in 1351, I mean, these kinds of episodes occurred all the time. In the 14th century, there are lots of little regional centers of power in the Balkans. Bulgaria, there are a couple of Bulgarias at sometimes, and Constantinople and the Serbs and the Latins and so forth. And there are many, many moments when they can make this decision. Do we join together, or do we, unite against the Turks? Now, from just a simple sort of common sense point of view, absolutely. If they had united at this time, before the Turks had any sort of significant foothold in the Balkans, it could have made a huge difference. And it's entirely possible that Turkish expansion in the Balkans would never have happened. Like that is an entirely foreseeable and possible alternative future for these people at this time. But there are reasons why that didn't happen. And the reason why it didn't happen is because possibly no one at this time is thinking of the Turks as a kind of monolithic imperial entity that's just going to come and conquer the Balkans. What they're dealing with instead are with smaller groups of mercenary Turks, whom each of them is hiring in relatively smaller numbers in order to gain advantages over their neighbors, whoever they are. In fact, the Romans are doing so in their civil wars, right? And Kantakouzenos is one of the biggest offenders here because he kept involving Turks in his civil wars and bringing more and more of them into the Balkans to use against his own rivals, whether they were Roman or not. And so they're just not thinking in those kinds of terms of as an existential threat to our sovereignty that is affecting everybody together. They're thinking in terms of small rivalries, right? And that is, in the end, how the Turks managed to enter the Balkan politics and warfare, and eventually, take over all of them. It's pretty much exactly the same way as the Normans conquered southern Italy and Sicily. Like, this is exactly what they would do. You send out, mercenary groups, and they get involved in the warfare, and more come, and then they switch sides and take advantage of opportunities, and pretty soon you just have an invasion army, and by that point it's too late. But had they been able to unite, yes. The fundamentals, the preconditions for cooperation in this period are so bad. It's just very, very difficult to do. In fact, one of the something that was particularly outrageous at this time was that there had been an earthquake. It had cracked the dome of Hagia Sophia, and money was needed for the repairs, and lots of people sent money. And it was rumored, and I think it's probably credible, that Kantakouzenos used that money to hire Turks. Because that's what he was doing. That's what he's doing with all of his money, because Turkish mercenaries are the easiest thing to hire at this time. They're cheap, and they're happy to come along because they can raid and plunder along the way and make more money. So this was very offensive, and it's reported in the sources as just sort of outrageous. But it shows just how far from sort of Orthodox cooperating against the Turks this is gone.
And one more alternative history question, the last one. It is known that the Bulgarian king Simeon the Great had ambitions to become the basileus of the Roman Empire. If this had happened, what would be the possible future? The Romans would be Bulgarianized, or in terms of identity and language, or Bulgaria would be Romanized?
I don't think really either of those would happen, in part because, look, the Greeks had been conquered by the Romans in antiquity, and they became Romanized. They never lost like their language or their ancient culture or anything like that. And one emperor and his army does not make that kind of a difference. What's likely, one of two things would have happened in this scenario, whereby Simeon somehow becomes Vasilevs of the Romans in Constantinople. Either he would have had to take on a fully Roman profile very quickly in order to convince most of his now Roman subjects that he is sort of one of them and worthy to rule him. Or he would have been ousted in the next round of civil wars, palace coups, and whatever. So the likeliest scenario is that he would have been fully Romanized. But the thing is, he already sort of was. It wouldn't have been that hard for him. He could, we would then just have an alternative Simeon who would come out and say, oh, I've always, I grew up in this city. This is my city. Suddenly his Greek would be perfect and all of that. And I think then what happens, do you have a kind of joint kind of kingdom with the two populations, or more likely it would have split in the next civil war or something like that? Some other Bulgarian would have broken Bulgaria away and they would have just continued on in that way. I think that's the likeliest scenario, that the office would have changed the man rather than that either populations would have changed to any significant degree.
Any questions, guys?
No, we want to say big thanks to our guest.
It was amazing.
Yes. And I think we kept the conversation for almost 2 hours, and we really appreciate your thought and feedback and very, very well in-depth answers. So thank you so much for your
Thank you for
time
having me. This was a pleasure.
For such a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, great questions. And hello to all of the audience, and I hope this was informative. I'm sure I'll get a bunch of emails.
It was. Yeah. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
You have a wonderful evening.